I had spent 18 years learning how to disappear in a room, and I was doing it well that night in the corner of the Whitmore Group ballroom in a clearance rack dress, watching my husband work the crowd like a man auditioning for a bigger life. Before we walked in, he had told me to wear the navy dress, which was not a suggestion, and reminded me not to talk too much because these were important people. I had nodded the way I always nodded and followed him inside. And for the first 20 minutes I stood near the appetizer table with a glass of wine. I was not really drinking while he laughed too loudly at other people's jokes and introduced me to no one. I had almost stopped noticing the ache in my chest that came with evenings like this. The low, constant hum of a woman who had been told so many times to be smaller that she had eventually started believing smaller was her actual size. My name is Diana Mercer and I am 43 years old. The night my husband's boss crossed a crowded ballroom looking for me specifically, I had no idea who he was. His name was Warren Ashworth, chairman of the company, silver-haired and tall in the way that makes rooms rearrange themselves around a person without anyone quite deciding to do it. I watched his eyes scan the crowd the way you watch someone search for a face they are afraid they will not find. And then his gaze landed on me beside the appetizer table, and something happened to his expression that I could not name. Not recognition exactly. Something older than that. Something like a man seeing proof that a thing he had started to doubt was actually real. He stopped mid-sentence with someone else and walked directly toward me. And I stood there assuming I had done something wrong. Assuming I was about to be told quietly that I was standing in the wrong place, which would have been entirely consistent with the last 18 years of my life. He stopped in front of me, took my hand in both of his, and said in a voice that cracked open in the middle of the word that he had spent 20 years looking for me. The ballroom went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something happens that nobody rehearsed. 300 people turned to watch the chairman of the company hold the hand of a woman nobody at that event had ever bothered to learn the name of. And I searched his face for something familiar and found nothing at all. 20 years earlier, I had been 23, working the night shift at a diner outside Charlotte to pay for community college classes I took during the day, still holding on to the idea that my life was going somewhere. There had been a storm, the kind where you cannot see past your own headlights, and I had been driving home when I saw taillights at a wrong angle in a ditch off Route 9. A car had gone off the road on black ice, folded on the driver's side, door jammed. I had climbed down into the freezing rain in my work uniform without a coat and forced that door open until my hands bled. I had pressed my scarf against the cut on his head the entire ambulance ride because he would not stop bleeding, and I would not let go of him. I had stayed at the hospital until he was stable enough for surgery, signed my first name on the emergency contact form, and left before he woke up because I had a shift starting in 4 hours and a mother who needed help with rent. It had never once occurred to me that it mattered. I had simply done what anyone would do and gone back to my ordinary life. Warren told me he had kept the scarf, that he had spent months going back to that hospital, then hired someone to find me once he had money to hire someone, and found nothing because I had left only a first name and no trail. He told me he had built his entire company in the years after that accident as a man who understood he had been given a second chance by a stranger who wanted nothing in return, and that not being able to thank me had quietly eaten at him for 2 decades. He told me this in front of everyone, his voice not quite steady. His board members and his executives and 300 of his employees all watching the chairman cry in a ballroom, which told me more about who he was than anything else could have. I became aware slowly of my husband standing near the bar, his glass frozen halfway to his mouth, his face doing something I had never seen it do in 18 years of marriage. Then Warren turned toward him, politely and finally, and said his name and asked whether he had known. My husband laughed the laugh he uses when he is caught without a prepared answer, and said I had never mentioned it, that I was just not one for the spotlight. Warren looked at him for a moment and said that was exactly what made it remarkable. That I had never used what I had done to get anything from anyone. Not recognition, not money, not even a thank you. And that was the kind of person most companies would be fortunate to have anywhere near their work. Then he offered me his arm and asked if I would join him at the head table, and my husband stepped forward instinctively, assuming the invitation included him the way every door that opened for me in our marriage had somehow always become a door he walked through first. Warren looked at him once, polite and clear, and said that I was his guest tonight. I watched my husband stand in front of his colleagues and his boss, and every person whose opinion he had spent his career managing, and I took Warren's arm and walked to the head table while the room watched. In the car afterward, Richard told me I had embarrassed him. He asked what exactly had happened that night 20 years ago and whether there was something I was not telling him. And the accusation landed the way accusations do when they are delivered quietly, as if they are simply observations. I felt something old and exhausted inside me finally stop holding. I told him I had not embarrassed him, I had exposed him, and that those were two different things he had always known the difference between. He did not answer that. The investigation that followed was not something I had anything to do with. Warren had simply started asking the quiet questions that powerful men ask when something does not sit correctly. And what surfaced from my husband's years at that company did not need any help from me to be damning. The padded expense reports, the analyst's proposal he had taken credit for, the newsletter profile painting him as a devoted family man built on photographs of a life he had spent years diminishing in private. Richard called it a witch hunt. It was not. It was the truth arriving on its own schedule. I left him 3 weeks after the gala. I set my wedding ring on the kitchen table and told him I did not need an audience to be worth something, and walked up the stairs feeling the air around me expand for the first time in longer than I could name. I moved into a small apartment across town and spent the first weeks relearning what I actually wanted, not what kept the peace, not what made someone else comfortable, just what I wanted. I found a foundation Warren's company had quietly funded for years supporting women rebuilding after controlling marriages, and I got involved slowly and then more fully, sharing my story in pieces with women who needed to hear that starting over at 43 was not a defeat. It was just a beginning that arrived late, which is still a beginning. Warren and I built something real over the months that followed, unhurried and honest, the way things grow when neither person needs the other to perform. He never once made me feel that I owed him anything for a rainy night on Route 9, and somewhere in that patience I found the woman who had climbed into that ditch without hesitating, the one who had never actually disappeared. She had only been waiting for someone to stop asking her to be smaller long enough for her to remember her